In my final example, I want to discuss enhancing your textures using Photoshop or some of the effects in your digital art application. So first, let's add some basic texture to the plane, but this time I'm going to leave the composite method set to default. I'm going to select kind of a darker gray color. I'll select the sponge. I'll add in some sponge texture. I'll just make sure that it goes into perspective here. If it helps, you can switch to something like multiply just to get a feel for how it's going to blend. But for now, we want to leave it at default. That's because now we're going to save a copy of our artwork by going to Save As. And we're going to open this composition in Photoshop. Now I'm going to select that same texture layer that I created earlier. I'm going to zoom in a bit so I can see it closer. And down here at the bottom of the Layers palette, I'm going to click on FX. And let's add a live effect for bevel and emboss. And you're going to see some magic happen here. All of a sudden, it's going to make your texture look three-dimensional. And then you can, of course, change the angle of the light source. We can make it coming from the top as it should be. Bring it in a little bit more towards the center to make it more prominent. And that's looking better. Then we can play with the depth. If we want it to stick up more, we can play with the size. If we want it to be finer or thicker, we can change the style from inner bevel to outer bevel. That gives us a whole different effect. We can try emboss, pillow emboss, stroke emboss, kind of like pillow emboss. And then again, you can play with the depth just to fine tune this and get it looking the way you want. But all of a sudden, that flat texture that we added with the sponge now has 3 dimensions. Click on OK. And now we can change the composite method to overlay. That way it'll blend with the background better. And we can, of course, play with the opacity if we want a more subtle blend. And there you go, we have our texture. Now, in order to bring this back into Corel Painter or any other art application outside of Photoshop, you need to now apply this effect. So what you can do is you can go to File, and then Scripts, Flatten All Layer Effects. And that's gone ahead and applied that permanently as a layer. Again, I'll need to change that back to Overlay. And then I could save this again as a PSD and bring it back into Corel Painter and continue working on it. I'm going to undo a few steps, and I'm going to remove that bevel and emboss, and let's try another effect. Let's go to Filter, Stylize, and then Emboss. And Emboss gives us kind of a similar effect. It elevates the edges and creates valleys, so this might work to give you a different kind of effect here. Try something like that. If I zoom in, you can see that I have that nice fractal pattern there. Then I can, of course, play with the opacity to get a little more fine-tuning out of that. And you could, of course, do combinations of the two. After I've embossed it, I can still add another layer of bevel and embossing. And this time I could do pillow emboss, and I could put in some big lumps in between all those cracks there. Now I have yet another organic-looking texture. Let's go ahead and do some undos and backtrack to our original here. Let's double-click on Effects here, or add a new effect down at the bottom of the Layers palette. Let's try Drop Shadow. We'll turn up the opacity. We'll move the distance just slightly off. And now this might be kind of hard to see, but what it does is it creates kind of a drop shadow edge. We could add another effect by double-clicking on Effects. We could choose Inner Shadow. We could set that to Screen, set the color to white, increase the opacity, and again, play with the distance and the size to get the kind of effect that you want. If we do it before and after, you can see that it's adding kind of an edge to that and helping that stand out. And again, it gives us another kind of texture. So you can get all kinds of different textures here just by playing with these different enhancements. And as long as you're working with your PSD here in Photoshop and you don't open it in Corel Painter, these layers should still be editable. So if you wanted to go in and edit your inner shadow, you could do that. You could change it from Screen to Overlay, then it'll blend a little bit differently with the background. If you wanted to make that multiply instead of overlay, you could do that. And again, you get a different kind of texture. There's all kinds of different filters and effects in Photoshop and the other applications that you use for making your art. So experiment with those and you might come up with some really interesting techniques for creating textures. So at this point, you might be wondering, why did I use the bevel feature in Photoshop rather than the bevel feature in Corel Painter? Because Corel Painter does have a bevel plugin. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. I have a very similar spongy layer here that I created, just a regular default layer. And down here in the bottom left of the Layers palette, there's dynamic plugins, very similar to Photoshop's live effects, and we can choose Bevel World. Now, depending on the complexity of the bevel that you're trying to create, it may take a couple seconds to load Bevel World, or it may take half a minute to load Bevel World. And for me, I'm on a pretty fast computer right now, and it's taking quite a bit of time. As I'm talking here, it's still loading, and I'm probably going to have to just hang out and wait for Bevel World to load. You may think that your computer's crashed. No, it has not crashed. It just takes a really, really, really long time to load a bevel for something like this. It has to bevel all these individual cracks and crevices that I painted with my sponge, but Photoshop doesn't seem to have a problem doing it, and so that's why I prefer Photoshop. Bevel World does work well, however, it just takes a really, really long time to load, and occasionally when it does load, it really doesn't work. Like you can see down here at the bottom, it's beveling this lower area, but it's leaving everything in the center unbeveled. So maybe we want to play with the bevel width, see if that helps. It's taking a really long time to update. We can move the light and that moves, but it's really not getting everything here. So yes, there's Bevel World. Yes, you can try it. You can play with all the settings if you want to, and if it's working for you, use it. If not, and you have Photoshop, I recommend that you do your beveling in Photoshop. It'll really just save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches. So I'm going to cancel out of Bevel World here. If you're using a digital art application other than Photoshop or Corel Painter, it might have a bevel filter too, so definitely keep an eye out for that. So there you go. That's a variety of ways to create textures in Corel Painter and other digital art applications. In the next lesson, we'll use the skills that we've learned so far to create 5 common types of texture: stone, sand, wood, fur, and skin. That's coming up next.